Good morning and welcome to day number 3 of our conference. My name is Allan Njanji and this is our Building Bridges conference. I'm delighted to chair this panel and have the opportunity to hear about different ways of thinking about decolonial research, knowledge use, and pedagogy. Day number 3 of our conference. My name is Allan Njanji. Each speaker will deliver their paper after my introduction. I'm delighted to chair this panel and have the opportunity to hear what. Sorry, my bad. So each speaker will deliver their paper after my introduction, and there will be time for discussion and questions at the end of the session after all the papers have been delivered. Our first presenter is Atilio Barreda. Atilio is a Peruvian software developer, an MSc student in data analysis and visualization at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and an adjunct lecturer in computer systems technology at the New York City College of Technology. His research includes network science, machine learning, critical data studies, and postcolonial studies. His paper titled Embedded Humanities in Data Systems compares data management practices of contemporary, cloud-distributed global culture to those of pre-Columbian society. Our second presenter is Nabeela Musthafa. Nabeela is a second-year doctoral student at the National Institute of Technology, Calicut in India. Her research explores innovative methods in early childhood education and also attempts to address issues posed by the marginalized children with respect to accessibility to equality, early childhood education. Her paper titled Decolonising Early Childhood Educational Curriculum and Pedagogy in India, Initiatives and Challenges. The paper looks at the provision of alternative education practices which reject Western-influenced curriculum and assessment, and instead replaces it with learning and assessment particular to the Indian context. Our third presenter is Sara Bdeir. Sara is a second-year PhD candidate in education at Nottingham, Trent University. She is interested in non-formal education for refugees, especially creative art projects. Her doctoral work explores the role of the linguistics identities of refugees in their social integration with creative writing groups. Her paper titled Refugee, Linguistic Identity and Social Integration in Creative Writing Groups, a Narrative Inquiry. The paper investigates the role of the linguistic identities of refugees in their social integration within the context of creative writing groups. We are hoping to be joined by a fourth presenter who is going to make a live presentation and will provide more information on his paper when he joins us. I hope we'll have a lively discussion and question and answer session after we've listened to the presentations. So please submit your questions in the live chat function as you listen, or send them by email to the address buildingbridges@ntu.ac.uk. Please note that this event includes live automated closed captioning generated by Teams, and that these may include some mistakes. Thanks once again, and enjoy these great presentations.
I'm going to be talking about data systems, and I'm going to be talking about some contemporary databases and an indigenous data system called the Kipu. Here's a quote. When designing distributed web services, there are 3 properties that are commonly desired: consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. It is impossible to achieve all 3. The quote above is about an important challenge in contemporary computing. The paper in which it was published by Seth Gilbert and Nancy Lynch explain and formalize the fundamental problems when dealing with large-scale distributed data. And that is that applications operating on web scale, such as social networks or search engines, could not expect a database management system to work in the same way that it did with traditional smaller scale projects. As internet adoption and screen time increased, the kinds of social and technical interactions on it proliferated. From a way to share static text and images and links to other static text and images, the internet started to become a site for interactive content production and consumer as well as business-to-business commerce. As the increase in internet adoption and activity put novel demands and strains on database systems, computer science researchers and industry programmers were eager to understand and mitigate challenges of what is now called big data. Assumptions which were previously taken for granted in database systems, such as the ability for database users to get the most up-to-date content from the database, weren't true in this new ecosystem where data existed in different distributed locales. The conclusion is somberly that when working with distributed data, you cannot assume the same set of rules as working with a single database, and thus have to give up some socio-technical expectations, like the ones mentioned in the quote above. It is in this historical context in which NoSQL databases emerge. These databases were designed with polymorphic or varied data in mind. Through new socio-technological expectations, these databases represented a new context for data management, often invoking practical compromise to deal with the impossibility of commonly desired attributes in this new distributed system. And so the Inca Empire was a large-scale organization, and as such, it needed to keep financial and operational records to manage and administrate across thousands of miles and millions of subjects. The main data management tool used by the Incas in this endeavor was the quipu. The quipu is a portable recording device made of strings tied into cords and strategically placed knots. It has been shown to document numerical and simple categorical data. It is also thought that quipus encode more complex data. However, more advanced encodings have not yet been deciphered. Due to the diversity of quipu components, such as string color, ply direction, or color patterning, the potential for encoding complex and multidimensional data is high and motivates contemporary statistical and social science research. Quipus have been found that likely represent credits and debits, as well as tax records of the official Inca state. Quipus were deployed across the Inca Empire, known to its inhabitants as Tawantinsuyo, which is translated as the four parts together. In several cases, copies of data were stored in remote locations with masters located in the Inca capital of Cusco. Quipus use knots and their relative position to record numbers. Inca quipus use a base 10 system. However, older pre-Inca quipus have been found which use base 5. And researcher Ashok Khosla finds this intriguing because of the relative little usefulness gained in changing a number system from 5 to 10, unless you like to half or quarter things. As Incas indeed, especially as an expanding empire, did have a fondness for having quartering things, from the capital city of Cusco to granary buildings, and of course the empire itself, meaning 4 parts together. The transition from the use of base 5 to base 10 can be viewed as an example of how ideology interpolates subjects, who then internalize these modes of logic. Chun discusses this interpolation, a term borrowed from Althusser, using software as an imperfect metaphor for ideology. She states, software interpolates the user, calls it, and offers it a name or image with which to identify. However, as a large-scale data management tool used for political arithmetic, the quipu also seems to embody the same space as software does for Chun. The quipu enables a large-scale distributed data system, one often used to have and quarter land, labor, and resources, and one which requires specialized labor to keep the whole data system going. This labor is made easier by the use of base 10 or decimal system. Thus, the switch from base 5 to base 10, although expressed as a formal change in the number system, is an example of a socio-technical decision aimed at consolidating political power across a distributed empire. And so, as this leads me to Donna Haraway, who notes, it follows that politics and ethics ground struggles and contests over what counts as rational data. Again, now we have, now I want to talk about mathematician Marcia Asher and anthropologist Robert Asher, who described the inevitability of the Inca bureaucracy and appeared to strengthen Chun's and Haraway's arguments on subjects. Hand in hand with massive construction, standing armies, and all other attributes of the state, there is always a bureaucracy to administer its affairs. So this observation supports Haraway's conjecture that knowledge projects ultimately owe their guiding structure to politics and ethics. The quipu makers, known as quipu kamayaks, and those in charge of transporting quipus, known as chasquis, become necessary political actors and identities in the Inca Empire. Their very identities motivated by technologies of political administration. Quipu kamayaks, always male, were trained in Cusco and then sent throughout the empire as political need dictated. Despite being subject to being moved around, the quipu kamayaks worked with privileged information and so were privileged, according to the Ashers. And so then the quipu kamayak was then a numerate, highly educated person who was privileged, but not among the ruling elite who governed the Inca Empire. Furthermore, among quipu kamayaks, there was a hierarchy, with some representing large areas of land and others representing smaller local concerns. In contemporary society, there also exists a privileged, yet not necessarily bourgeoisie, type of information worker, the software engineer. Though not a state rule, most now tend to be men, and many work on web applications that do some sort of political arithmetic. From financial technology to bidding on government contracts, software developers like quipu kamayaks are important, but not as important as those who wield the most authority in their communities. So here, Chun's discussion of software interpolation helps underscore that technologies from quipus to web-scale databases are created with users in mind, and without this user, the data is inaccessible. As social and financial trends increase the amount and types of data being created, software engineers struggled with complex distributed data and started wanting more flexible, user-friendly options to deal with this. And while the traditional way of storing data is focused around the relational database, in which software engineers must know how data will be structured ahead of time, a different concept or paradigm was starting to emerge. And while many relational databases evolved to meet the new challenges with varying degrees of success, the desire for fundamentally new ways of working with data also emerged, with NoSQL databases. As Chun notes, one is not aware of software's constraint constriction and interpolation, also known as its user-friendliness, unless you find yourself frustrated with its defaults. As data evolved to be more complex, software engineers found themselves at odds with the defaults in data analysis. And this directly impacted how they performed their labor. Relational databases proved not to be user-friendly for a large number of real-world concerns and challenges, and alternatives began to emerge. These databases, now known collectively as NoSQL databases, are built with contemporary issues such as distribution, complex data forms, and highly connected data in mind. NoSQL databases emerged as a series of techniques to deal with complex and distributed data on the internet, in much the same way that the quipu was developed and iterated on to deal with complexities of managing an empire at scale. as these technologies serve a general socio-political and administrative purpose, but in vastly different concepts. However, in comparing each semiotic technologies, we can gain insight into the politics and ethics of each culture. Anthropologist Gary Urton, a Kipu scholar, investigates the Quechua number system, which was the basis for the numerical representation. And he states, numbers are not conceived of in Quechua ideology as abstractions whose nature and relations to each other rely on the predictions of pure logic, as in the West. Rather, numbers are conceptualized in terms of social, especially family and kinship. One consequence of their participation in social life is that all of the linguistic formulations and grammatical constructions that are used to talk about inheritance, succession, dependence, and interdependence within a kin group can be applied to number identities and numerical relations. And so, despite sharing a decimal system, contemporary Western and pre-Columbian Quechua mathematics are based on fundamentally different understandings. A familiar post-Enlightenment position would celebrate Western abstraction or the reduction of numbers as the result of first-order logic. Quechua's association of numbers to social relations would be seen as a burden of specificity, while Western mathematics numbers are universal and promise transcendence. But could this burden of social relations also be a productive source of cultural insight into how a society or culture thinks? Haraway's method would not only find value in Quechua's number system and its social ontology, but perhaps even elevate it as an example of situated knowledges. As the Quechua number system does not pretend to be from everywhere and nowhere at once, or to be free from interpretation. And that was a Haraway quote, I apologize. It is this partial view which enables the connection and understandings which make situated knowledges productive. Haraway states, situated knowledges are about communities, not about isolated individuals. And so the only way to find larger vision is to be somewhere in particular. And I think this can be said about how the Quechua number system relies on rhetoric for familial relations. As data technologies both produce and enable modes of labor, a data system in which counting is linked inherently to social structures represents a model in which knowledge production doesn't attempt to hide the social relations involved in its creation. In Of Grammatology, Derrida cites Rousseau from an unedited essay on languages. Rousseau writes, writing is nothing but a mere representation of speech. Derrida also discusses Saussure, who viewed writing as derivative because it is a representation of speech. Perhaps because Quechua numbers also represent social relations, there is no spoken word for zero. There are some words that mean nothing or empty, but as a number, zero does not exist. As numbers are supposed to be able to be possessed and be possessed by others, perhaps having a spoken term for zero would violate this cultural norm. However, in Iquipu, zero is visually represented by the lack of a knot on a chord at a specific location. Having a so-called derivative term for a concept or signified, which has no spoken word or primary signifier, refutes the view that writing is necessarily a lossy copy of speech. Applying deconstruction in the service of uncovering postcolonial logic works by underscoring the politics and ethics behind knowledge production and its labor. That zero exists in speech's supplement, but not in speech itself, helps problematize this colonial logic. The Kipu is conceptually similar then to the class of NoSQL databases, and specifically graph databases. Graph databases mentioned earlier utilize the mathematical rules of graph theory developed in the early 17th century to quickly and efficiently store and analyze highly complex network information. The ability to add additional data quickly is prioritized when developing graph databases because they are meant to deal with complex and changing data. The Kipu could also be easily scaled as the addition of a chord can extend the dimensionality or scale of a data set. Neo4j, a modern graph database, uses mathematical and network science methods to store and analyze network data, such as social relationships. A central tenet of network science is that homophily, often described as the doctrine that similarity breeds connection, and homophily is used to program social recommendation systems for social networks or products. However, homophily was discovered by a 1954 study on racially segregated housing, in which only white residents' responses were used for analysis. That segregated housing was used as the model for studying so-called natural connections among people ignores the socio-technical decisions involved in construction of segregated communities. Now, database vendors, in an effort to be user-friendly to the software engineer subject, have functionality built in to capture homophily or structural equivalence. While I position the logic of the Kipu as a means to critique the West neo-colonialist project, I do not seek to impose a Rousseau-style God trick and declare Incan or pre-Columbian civilization in general as noble savages. Many privileged Kipu Kamayaks were conscripted from different tribes, and while Inca governance allowed for some form of multiculturalism within the empire, the empire itself expanded primarily through military conquest. Thus, some of the political arithmetic performed using Kipus must have been in the service of colonizing neighboring communities. I mention this not to imply that the West and colonized indigenous cultures are in actuality on the same footing, since both partake in colonization, but to avoid the trap of cultural relativism, which Haraway states promises a vision from everywhere and nowhere equally and fully.
Hi everybody. My paper is titled Decolonizing Early Childhood Education, the Curriculum and Pedagogy in India. So we'll be discussing some of the initiatives and challenges. Just a second. Yeah. The study is based entirely on published research. Now, talking about early childhood education in developing countries like China and India, it arrived or they started, setting up preschools and kindergartens around the 19th century. The model they followed was usually Montessori, Froebel, or sometimes part of missionary activities. And so, during the pre-independence period in India, you have we had infant schools which were set up by missionaries. That was probably the beginning of early childhood education. And then you have Maria Montessori's visit in 1939, which made a very long-lasting impact. In fact, Montessori is still being implemented in most of the kindergartens and preschools across India by both the public as well as the private sector. So it was her visit to India which made one of the major impacts. And Tarabai Modak is an Indian educational reformer who founded the Gram Bal Shiksha Kendra, also known as the Rural Child Education Center. So this is also known as this center is also known as the better or more commonly known as Balwadi or Anganwadi right now. So what she did was she adapted Montessori system, the Montessori method, in order to meet the needs of rural children, that is marginalized poor children from rural parts of India. And then you have, it's in the post-independence period that the government actually started, Indian government actually started playing a role or getting to involve and contribute to the field of early childhood education in India. They began by setting up this new child education society, which aimed to universalize Montessori-based child education as a contribution to nation building. So this is about the the beginning of the Montessori system, and which is actually not an Indian approach or a notion, but an Italian educational reformers approach, which is still being continued, even though it began during the pre-colonial times. Even today in post-colonial India, we are still continuing, this, we are still following this method. So there were, in fact, there were people or leaders like Tagore and Gandhi who were against colonial education, who wanted to overcome the defects of colonial schooling, and they wanted to re-establish lost traditions of teaching and learning and all. But somehow, as far as early childhood education is concerned, Montessori and Reggio Emilia and the Waldorf method have all sort of sustained and continued even today. So some of the initiatives to break free from this were brought in by the National Education Policy last year, 2020, where they lay down general guidelines for the educational system at large, and they have emphasized on the need to promote multilingualism and respect for the local context. And that in all curriculum, as well as pedagogy and policy, irrespective of the grade. So right from the foundational stage onwards, that is pre-primary onwards, you have both the curriculum and pedagogy, according to the National Education Policy, should be redesigned to be strongly rooted in Indian and local context and ethos in terms of culture, traditions, etc. So the reason for this that the NEP states is that this is a way in which education can be made more relatable, relevant, as well as effective for Indian students. So NEP also recommends the usage of local or regional language as the medium of instruction right from pre-primary or early childhood education up until grade 5. And even the policy even advocates employing teachers who are either bilingual or who are able to communicate and reduce the gap or bridge the gap that the child has with the medium of instruction and the learning material. So that is one initiative. The other initiative that helps to decolonize early childhood education is alternative education, which tries to break away from colonial influences, in the sense that by alternative education, I am referring to any form of educational or pedagogical approach which stays away or is different from the mainstream education. So it could be homeschooling, it could be self-education, or even open schools, which are independent and not mainstream in nature, more freer, and not following Western curriculum or pedagogy. So often these sort of alternative educations were rooted in various philosophies, and some of the strategies they followed to break away, purposely break away from colonial influence and revive Indian culture. So they did this by moving away from rote learning. That is one thing, which is a system which was introduced by colonial education, according to Tagore and all. And another initiative that they brought in was the wider use of local language and regional languages. And this came in before the National Education Policy 2020 came in. So and that was a big, initiative by alternative education, so education systems in India. So another thing they did was they tried to bring back respect for regional languages, beliefs, and traditions, and basically more of learning that is rooted in Indian culture and Indian geography and Indian language. So moving on to challenges, Moving on to the challenges, alternative education. What happened was it was mostly experimental in nature. So, like there was no a solid evidence or scientific evidence in favor of the approaches that they used or the new methods that they adopted, and it was quite subjective in nature. So, this meant that it was it sort of fell into the exclusive and elitist category, because low income or underprivileged sections of the society had like zero access to such alternative forms. So this is one of the challenges that I have to, that my study has tried to portray. And another one is that many open alternative schools turned into mainstream ones over time. Like they either began as alternative and then converted themselves into mainstream, or some of them had alternative for the younger students, and the mainstream education, traditional mainstream curriculum and pedagogy was followed for the higher grades. And another thing is, once these students were educated in these alternative forms, in these free independent schooling systems, entered into college or higher education where the traditional system is being followed, there was a sort of culture shock, because suddenly they have to, everything is completely syllabus based, it's more stressful, and there's a reward for rote learning. So this could be another challenge. And when we're talking about the national education policy also, all this all the initiatives or all the plans they have for multilingualism or bilingualism, and for using more of Indian and regional languages in the up until grade 5, and even beyond is recommended. So this brings in a question of how are these kids going to face the international job market with like little to zero communication skills in English. So this is a question, and this is a challenge, and this strategy of decolonizing produces. So to conclude, I'd like to re-emphasize on the need for a decolonizing approach, especially for early childhood education, because children need to be need to feel rooted in their own culture, their own land, rather than and using their own stories or songs. So there is this, and there's also this widespread belief in the Indian society that Western curriculum and practices in early childhood education, especially, are superior or better for the development of children. So there needs to be a realization that maybe those approaches are appropriate or developmentally appropriate for children in the West, but not for our children, Indian children. And that is one thing. And I'd like to end this by again saying that there is a need to rethink and reconceptualize childhood in post-colonial India, and also to contribute to the process of decolonizing the Indian system of early childhood education. And for this to happen, it is important to break away from early childhood education, which is still dependent on Western curriculum and pedagogical approaches, like the ones based on Maria Montessori or Howard Gardner, or there are many alternative schools which base their curriculum on Rudolf Steiner's Waldorf method. So all this needs to be, changed. Yeah. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today on this important conference on building bridges. This is Sara Bdeir. I'm a second-year PhD candidate in education at Nottingham, Trent University. My research project is about the development of refugees as writers in creative writing groups in the UK. I'll start with an extract of a poem by Grace Nichols, who moved from Guyana to the UK. I've crossed an ocean, I've lost my tongue, from the root of the old one, a new one has sprung. In this extract of a poem, she tries to express the feeling of refugees who lost their voice in migration and trying to gain their voice again. And this this extract summarizes my whole project, in which we are looking about the development of refugees, they're finding their voice again. Here are some of the keywords that resonate with Building Bridges conference. So some like agency, identity, political displacement, creative practices, especially creative writing. In my presentation, I'll be covering some of the points as research focus, non-formal education, creative writing for refugees, moving to the conceptual framework and the method of the research, and ending with the ethics and a message to the higher education as a conclusion. Now, in order to position myself as a researcher related to this field, so why refugees, why creative writing, and why in the UK? So why refugees? I am an offspring of refugees. My own family survived the 1967 war in Palestine, and they immigrated to Jordan. And I grew up listening to those stories, and I realized how important narration is for them. They want someone to hear their stories. They want their stories to go out there. And then later on, I joined the Warwick Creative Writing programs, and one of the modules was Warwick Writing Program for Schools, in which we managed to visit grade 3 students a number of times, and we shared some creative writing activities. And I realized how important is sharing stories even for the younger generation. I also attended a session for London Refugee Creative Writing Group, and I started wondering, how do we actually design those workshops? Does it really benefit the refugees? And from that, the research idea came. And why in the UK? The UK, as you know, is a host country for refugees. And because of the high number of refugees, it's important to have collaborative effort between the government and the community to help refugees to settle in and to integrate in the society. So moving to the research focus, which has been an ongoing journey, as you know, it developed a lot with time, changed a lot, and so on. So mainly I'll be looking at the development of refugees as writers in a second language within creative writing groups. And when I say creative writing groups, I'm only limiting the context to refugee community organizations. And these are organizations led mainly by people from a community who include significant number of refugees and whose service and activities are intended for refugees. So we would find these organizations in cities where there is a high number of refugees. Moving back to the development as writers, I'll be looking at 3 aspects. How do refugees develop their sense of meaning in writing? How do they develop their sense of agency? And what kind of support do they give and receive in those groups? It's important to highlight some definitions before we move on in order to give a better idea of the conceptual framework and also the methodology later on. So we are talking about social identity. So social identity means our knowledge or the individual knowledge that they belong to a certain groups, and they also have some emotional significance to them. So in this case, we have refugee identity, we have maybe writer's identity, could be student's identity. In our case, it can be, let's say for today, we are presenters, audience identity, we have males, females, and so on. Part of the social identity is the social cure perspective, which focuses on the relation between group membership and well-being, and how group membership can affect actually our sense of meaning, agency, and support. And these are the 3 aspects that I have built my research on. Also, I'll be talking about the writer identity, and this is a term developed by Rose Ivanich, in which she's talking about people who join a certain practice in writing or in speaking, and they affiliate themselves with this identity. In Ivanich writer identity, she mentioned 4 types of identities, which I'll be mentioning with the conceptual framework later on. Now, as my research is part of the Institute of Education, people might wonder why is it education, although it's not really education. Creative writing groups usually classify under non-formal education. Non-formal education is institutionalized, intentional, and planned, but it's not equal to formal education. It can be an alternative or a complement. So usually it's in short courses, workshops, a few days, few weeks, and can be open to all age groups, so elderly. Sometimes it's specific to maybe children, maybe elderly, but it's usually open to all age groups. And the main difference is that it doesn't lead to formal qualification. As we know that joining formal education like universities and school can be a long process, especially for refugees until they get their status and official papers. So collaborative effort from communities in the UK can be seen, and we have one of the examples is the City of Sanctuary Initiative. I think it's in Nottingham, Derby, Leicester area. And this is an initiative where local communities provide art groups for refugees. They include drama, writing, and other skills. And these organizations, they came from a dire need for joint effort, as I mentioned earlier, between all sectors to support refugees. It's really good that we have lots of creative art projects that exist already in the UK. We have over 100 projects, and here are some of them that are running currently. As we can see, I've mentioned here 5 projects, but I want you to look at the underlined sentences, and these summarizes the objectives of these groups. We can see that feeling of belonging, meeting other people, so socializing, gaining friends, gaining confidence, and we have also gaining voice. So although they vary slightly in their objectives, but mainly we are looking at themes of confidence, voice, friendship, and so on. So non-formal education usually would have a social aspect to it. Now moving to the conceptual framework of my research, so I'm combining 2 strands of theory. I'm combining the social cure perspective as part of the social identity theory and also the writer identity theory. And here we have, as I mentioned before, we have the meaning aspect, agency, and support. The meaning aspect is reflected in the autobiographical writer identity and also the discursive writer identity. In brief, the autobiographical writer identity refers to the writer's personality, life history, events that affect their writing and ideas. And discursive writer identity is how they present those ideas in writing. And moving to the agency, here we are looking at the authorial writer identity, their sense of empowerment, voice, agency, and how it comes into their writing. Finally, we're looking at the support, and this is reflected in the possibilities for selfhood in social, cultural, and institutional context. And here we're talking about how the social context, how being in such a group can affect a person's identity, can affect the way they get support and they receive support as well. In order to have a methodology and to collect data, as I'm talking about creative writing, I thought it's important to adapt a narrative inquiry approach. And in the narrative inquiry, we are mainly focusing on human beings and their narration and their stories. So I'll be looking at their own perspective, their own narration, and my raw data will be formed just from listening to refugees and their stories in this group. So the data collection is divided to 3 parts. So we have pre-writing interviews, poetic inquiry, and post-writing interviews. Just to briefly explain this, so in pre-writing interviews, I'll be asking questions about their migration experience, their sense of meaning within this group, sense of authority, finding a voice. Following that, I'll be asking members to provide me with pieces of writing that they have done within this group. I'll be looking at their poems, their short stories, and then after that, I'll have another interview where I am actually discussing those pieces of writing and asking them to speak to me about it. How did it come? What ideas did they develop? And so on. Poetic inquiry might not be a familiar term for everyone. So poetic inquiry is a subfield of the narrative inquiry. From the name, it focuses on poetry. And it gives a chance for the researcher to actually use poetry in the final product. It could be a thesis or a published paper. And we can use poems written from interview transcript or just the poems that the refugee or the participants have written. And the point of poetic inquiry is to add more life to the data and more life to the research. So you can hear actually the voices of refugees instead of just the analysis of the writer. Last but not least, it's important to mention the ethics consideration when doing a research with refugees. So although the questions that I have designed are not sensitive or not asking about any traumatizing experiences, still asking refugees any questions about the writing journey can reveal some emotions. So it's important for the researcher to direct the participant to any support channels, to give them the chance to stop the interview, to withdraw, to skip some questions if they don't want to answer. And also, if the researcher felt overwhelmed, they can space the interviews, they can ask the university if there are any support channels, and so on. As we are in hopefully post-COVID era, but it's important to still consider the COVID risk guidance, to have a space between when doing the interviews, wear a mask, do a lateral flow test before conducting interview, just for the safety of everyone. Last, but finally, it's important, this project hopefully will spot a light on social identity and also writer identity, which are central parts of refugees' development. Research finding might encourage refugees to join art groups and to show how important they are for them, and also for university staff and for people who have qualification in the community to develop art workshops for refugees, to develop their understanding, their sources, and hopefully to help refugees to integrate in the British society. These are some of the sources that I have used today. And thank you for listening. It was a pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you so much to the panelists for the presentation. And I would like to say thank you especially to Atilio, Sara, and Nabeela, who will come here to join us for the discussion. We are not so sure if the other presenter will join us mid-conversation, but we will press ahead. I wanted to start by saying that your presentations really embody the spirit of the Building Bridges Conference. It is really inspiring to have a diverse subject content papers, though there are intersections that we can draw upon. I can already see some of the linkages between some papers that we presented today and also those presented yesterday and the day before, which really delve into identity and social structures. In all your presentations today, I've been particularly interested in the various elements of intersectionality in the knowledge generation through decolonial research, and how that even links with progressive indigenous focused pedagogy. If I could pose the first question to you, Atilio, this is coming from Margaret Ravenscroft. Yeah. She says, I feel your work is exemplar of the conversations and knowledge sharing this conference is meant to facilitate. In your research, have you come across other transnational or transcultural modes of data management, which might also be included in a decolonizing approach to understanding modern information systems?
Wow, thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. Second of all, so I've definitely, I'm focusing on the Kipu right now, just because there's, I mean, so much for me to learn, even at, you know, at this point. I have done some reading, and saw a presentation. The name is blanking, and I apologize, but there was a professor or postdoctoral fellow at Brown who worked on the both kind of the Kipu as a methodology, as well as aspects of Maori of Maori culture as well. There's been analysis of other types of number systems that I think are very are also very how can I say deal with the same notions of assumptions that specific cultures take as well. So sorry if that was rambly, but yeah, that's my limited experience of other systems.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I've got another question that's coming from Beth Evans. It's a question for Sara, and she says, can you speak to the complexities of approaching non-formal education, that is creative writing, within creative writing groups, from the position of formal education in an academic conference?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the question. I'll take this question from 2 points. And first of all, it's important to introduce non-formal education in educational settings, because the ones who can start these groups are actually teachers, maybe ESOL teachers, maybe people who are interested in drama, literature, or different fields. So it's important to find the link between formal and non-formal education. I'll give one example of a conference that happened a few months ago. It was the University of Sanctuary Initiative, in which they try to indulge refugees in the higher education system. And that comes from collaborative efforts between the formal sector and the non-formal as well. From the other point, the complexities mainly will be from the ethical point. So doing a research with the refugees needs to have a lot of ethical considerations. They are a bit worried about approaching, if we approach them, because they don't know if we want something legal from them, if we were going to ask sensitive questions. So it's important for us as PhD candidates or researchers to be aware of these sensitivities and to assure the refugees that we are not going to ask something harmful, something sensitive. If they want to sort of withdraw from the conversation at any point, they can do so, and so on. So these are the both points that I can answer with. But if you want me to clarify further, let me know. Thank you.
Brilliant response. Thank you, Mohammed, for that. Yeah, a question from Perna, and this is for Nabeela. It's a rather long one. So he says, while decolonizing Indian school curricula is necessary, uncritically falling back to the so-called Indian culture, tradition, and pedagogical practices are also problematic, because these can be highly patriarchal and egoistic. Also, there has been so much protest against the NEP recently for the teacher community and civil society in general for its right-wing content. Given that school education is a fundamental right under Indian constitution, don't you think homeschooling self-education is, as an alternative, are basically tactics by the government to avoid its responsibility by shifting it to people themselves? Your comments, please.
Yeah. So about this comment on being highly patriarchal and jingoistic, I'm not sure, because we are not talking about using the age-old methods or the pedagogy or the curriculum which we used back in the pre-colonial times. We are talking about incorporating Indian culture as it is right now into our learning system. So if we're talking about doing it in this generation, so I'm not concerned with the patriarchal thing. But as you said, the NEP has brought out a lot of protest from the teacher community as well as from the student community, and I think that has a lot more to do with the higher education system and the policies they've brought out for the higher education rather than the early childhood education. But yes, self-education, homeschooling and all are probably things which the government should work more for. Like if they provide good quality early childhood education, they wouldn't be a matter of looking for alternative systems of education. So yeah, that's there. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you for that response. Another question coming from Valentino, and this is back to Atilio. And she goes, Thank you, Atilio. This was truly interdisciplinary. Do you think that Kipu ideology may be integrated to reimagine contemporary data systems, or do you think that they are inevitably incommensurable?
Thank you. So I definitely have hope that that these insights from the Kipu and and other kinds of non-Western systems can be incorporated. For example, I think I think something like the move to a base 10 Kipu can be seen as so it's a way to make kind of computation and storing data more efficient for the people who have to do it themselves. And I think that's kind of a way that technology works already, responding to users and whatnot. But it's also, but I think it can also be seen as an intentional, intentional process for a user, or as kind of socio-technical decision. So I'm definitely hopeful that that ideas that we find in that situation are applicable and useful for our kinds of data systems, and will hopefully prioritize kinds of technical processes that we've maybe not been thinking too much about, like sustainability and complex data in other terms.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant response. I've got an interesting question for Sara. This one is coming from Bethan Evans. She says, can you speak to the complexities of approaching? It's the wrong question. Yeah, it says that. How do you feel writing in a second language may impact the depth of the project for participants? It's a question for Sara. How do you feel writing in a second language may impact the depth of the project for participants?
Yes, very interesting question. So when we look at a second language writing group, it's different than writing groups for native speakers or for first language speakers. The aim of this group is totally different, because in those groups we are looking for the social aspect. So we're giving the participants a community and people who have similar stories to share. And also many of my participants reported having more confidence, and they learn to express in English. Because when they come to this country, they only have ESOL classes, which are English for second language classes. So they didn't have a chance to sort of express their feelings, which they really need to do after all the journey they've been through. So most of them reported expressing, learning how to use different words, how to use the language creatively. But I would say that the writing workshops are not that deep. So they would have long time chatting, eating, conversation, and then they will have like 10 minutes writing activity. So it's very, I would say, basic, and they would have the tools, how to write a poem, how to make it rhyme, and so on. But mainly we're looking for social aspects more than actually publishing a book or so on.
That's interesting, because my project as well involves working with refugees and asylum seekers, and there's always that disconnect when one's mother tongue is not English, and you have to use an interpreter. Now, using an interpreter, it kind of creates a barrier whereby there are some words that are lost in translation. And usually the feeling of the essence of what one is trying to narrate get lost in interpretation. So it's quite a fine balance. I would have preferred to have all of my interviews with my participants in their mother tongue, because they are able to express themselves from the heart. But I think it's one of those things that we just have to deal with as we progress in our research.
That's right. And whenever I have a chance to speak the native language of the participant, I'd give them the chance to sort of express themselves in the language too, if I speak it, of course. But...
Another question from Margaret is for Nabeela, and she says, how might we go one step further and reverse the patterns or legacies of colonization by incorporating indigenous and traditional ways of learning in Western childhood education curricula?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't thought about it, but that's a very interesting question, and I really wish I had included it in my study, that particular point. I haven't looked into it, but thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. This is a question for Atilio from Perna, and he says, thank you for an unraveling paper. Could you please speak a little about the rope or thread that the kipu was made of? What tree it came from, who grew it, how it was grown, given its importance in making kipu?
Yeah. So the kipu was typically made out of cotton or llama fiber, and yeah, I think that's kind of another thing that's related to that's related to kind of analysis of how this data system is materially composed, and so for example not only was it did it use these sort of specific raw materials depending on what was probably more available at the time. An important part of the kipu itself was also specific markings and specific colorings on the kipu. So depending on the local dyes, there would be different ways to categorize information. And certainly in terms of the llama, it was certainly in terms of a very crucial animal involved in geographical expansion because of its use as a pack animal that could traverse a large kind of different environments. So unfortunately, to be honest, I don't particularly know too much about the specific construction processes. I did watch an excellent YouTube video when I first starting on making a kipu by Jonathan Clendaniel, and so that's on YouTube. And I just wanted to have some experience, actually making it, and it's very challenging for me. But you can tell through the process, there's lots of like spinning cords and stuff like that. You can kind of tell that this is making it built to last. And so that was a big kind of portion of it, is creating this thing that is not only portable, but essentially it's portable in terms of like traveling with it, so it can survive in a bunch of different configurations. And I think that's a major a perk of the kipu as a data system. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Well, the next question is for you again, Atilio, and this is coming from Trent, and she says, there's a lot of interesting history of the Inca Empire in your presentation. Do you consider in your research how the ideologies of the Inca Empire inform or is reflective of the current ideological working of the contemporary society?
That's a good question. So I don't think directly, because I don't think I address that. Yeah, I don't think I address that directly. And honestly, mostly because I don't know enough about contemporary indigenous culture or even Peruvian culture in general. So I am from Peru, but I came to the U.S. on asylum, and kind of through understanding that, trying to understand everything, have really I guess found the need to to like interrogate and elevate my relationship with like indigenous culture. Look, I'm not indigenous, but I, even just through learning about history, I think that and anyone who isn't indigenous in South America has a huge debt to the indigenous people there. And my main interest is kind of I guess teasing out the differences between our contemporary like data cultures and perhaps different maybe base level or axiomatic assumptions that we might differ on, and see how that affects ways we interpret our culture. But but unfortunately nothing specifically with contemporary indigenous or South American culture. But that's a really great place to go, and thank you for that.
Yeah, brilliant response. Thank you, very much for that. I've got a question from Rach H, and it's a question for Sara. And she says, the interviews are encounters between individuals, while the creative writing groups are communal. Do you think the poems developed during these two types of encounter might be shaped differently based on the social context in which they are written?
Yes, thank you for the question. So basically, in my interviews, I'm focusing on three aspects. I'm focusing on as I mentioned, the meaning aspect, agency, and support. And I'm mainly looking at how they develop the social identity within this communal or within this group. So lots of questions will be how they support each other, how they develop their writing together, because lots of their writings are actually like poems written together line by line from each participant. I'm also, when asking for samples of writing, I'm only asking them to provide samples that are written in the same social context, which is within the group. So I'm not taking samples for my study from writing that they do at home or their diaries and so on, because I want it to be in the same, as you mentioned, the same context. Mentioning that, I ask in the beginning of the interview if they are published authors, because some of them might be published authors in their countries, if they write anything. And it's interesting to see how various participants are. Some of them are illiterate, they never wrote or read anything, and some of them are actually writers back home in their own language, and they're trying to find their voice in the second language. So I think speaking to individuals would give a perspective of the community they are participating in. Yes.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I've got an interesting question for Nabeela coming from Trent. And she goes, on a national scale and in the long term, can you talk a bit more about how feasible you think the alternative education is?
On a national scale, I don't think it's a very feasible option at the moment, because there is a wide gap between what is happening in the mainstream education and the alternative education system. So by the time the child is out of high school or higher secondary and enters into college, there is a big gap, and there's a lot of difference which he or she has to overcome. And there are still colleges and schools which don't take up children who have been brought up in the alternative education. So due to this factor, alternative practices are not exactly something feasible, but that's something that parents can just opt for when they're not happy with the mainstream education. So on a long-term basis and on a national scale, I would say it's not exactly a feasible thing. But at times, this is the option that we have for decolonizing the pedagogy and curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I've got another question coming from Margaret, and she says, this is for Sara, and she says, can you speak to the complexities of approaching non-formal education, creative writing groups, from the position of a formal education, and you being at NTU and doing a PhD? So
yeah, I think we've taken this question before, but I'll just summarize my answer.
Okay, sorry for that, yeah.
No problem. Where I've mentioned about the importance of linking non-formal education with the staff in the university, because they are the ones who can start writing groups. They can raise awareness of the importance of indulging or giving a chance for refugees to be part of higher education and the society as well. And I've also mentioned how ethics considerations are important when dealing with non-formal education and writing groups, whether refugees or elderly people and so on.
Brilliant stuff. Yeah, a question from Danny, and she just goes, I like this actually, says, thank you, it's a question for Atilio. Thank you for the amazing presentation, Atilio. I was wondering if you could tell us how you came to research such an interesting topic.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned, I am from Peru, and my dad was or is what they call an agricultural engineer. And so part of his job would be to kind of work with indigenous communities to with their agricultural practices, and in that he learned Quechua, and you know, would try to teach me, and I would think that, oh, this is so uncool because my dad does it, and I wasn't really interested in that kind of thing. And he would tell me about things like the quipu, and I'd be like, oh, that's, you know, kind of interesting, but it's something my dad's talking about, so it's not cool. I realized when I went to undergrad and started, I was really into well, and still am in some ways, like semiotics and post-structural theory, and I thought, wow, this is like so interesting to me. And then the quipu actually came back being referenced through those thinkers that I was, you know, really trying to engage with, and I was like, oh, wow, like my dad was actually like onto something, and this is actually very interesting. And I mean, at this point, I'm embarrassed that it, you know, it didn't click before, but it was a really cool entryway. Was kind of the semiotics combined with you know, the kind of post-structural theory that, you know, combines semiotics and post-colonialism, and I was like, oh wow, this is so interesting. And so I began to be really interested in it as a conceptual device. And recently, I've been lucky enough to come across more data science related work with the quipu that actually works with analyzing the relationships that may be represented, because on a big part of quipu research is decipherment right now. And so essentially, there's reason to believe that there is complex data encoded in quipus, but we haven't exactly figured out how to do that. And so there's been lots of work on just, you know, encoding the quipus themselves and the relationships that they might encode in a kind of statistical and data analysis way. And so that's how I kind of came to the realization as treating it as you know, pretty much a database system, and you know, working in tech, kind of the, you know, importance of what your data looks like and how it's stored is crucial, and I kind of started to draw these parallels from the quipu and data systems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. And just as a side question, is the quipu still being practiced? And if yes, what is it still being used for? Because, you know, one would think that, you know, people would just prefer the contemporary data systems. So is it still being practiced? And if yes, what is it being used for?
So in general, everyone is using more contemporary data systems right now, and there are instances of quipus being used after imperial conquest, and so there's one way to categorize quipus is in that kind of pre-empire and post-empire. One interesting and kind of, in my opinion, sad use of the quipu was it was crucial in terms of figuring out what to hand over to the Spanish and how much to do that. And so there was actually lots of quipu proliferation for that process, which was jarring to me in a way. But yeah. But in general, yeah, it's not used outside of a like academic or folkloric context in terms of actually storing data right now.
Okay. Oh, thanks for that. Yeah. I've got a question coming from Valentina, and it's a question for Nabeela. She says, you have indicated the challenges in your presentation that the new system might face. So the question is, do you have plans as to how to tackle the challenges that you discussed?
Okay, these are not plans exactly, but recommendations or maybe suggestions. I'd say if the public education system incorporated some of the elements of the alternative education, like incorporated some of the practices or approaches taken up by alternative schooling or curriculum, and somehow that would reduce the gap between the public system as well as the other, homeschooling and alternative systems on the other hand. That is number one. And number two, I'd say they have that is the national education policy, and the government is now promoting regional languages up until grade 5 as the language of instruction. So I would say along with the regional language, English is also essential. Even though we're talking about decolonizing, even now, when children come out in the job market, if they're not able to communicate in English, that is a problem. Unless the Indian, economy or the market is capable or strong enough to give jobs or employment opportunities for everybody, coming out of the Indian education system, I don't think it's a feasible idea. So these are two plans, or suggestions I'd probably give.
Thank you very much for that. Now, this question is kind of applies to all the presenters, and it's a question that is coming from Jenny. And the question goes, what would you recommend as one essential consideration when decolonizing education? So it could be education within your various fields. So what would you recommend as one essential consideration when decolonizing education? Anyone can start. Starting with you, Nabeela, since you're in education.
I think my previous answer is kind of connected with this, that the second language, you can't exactly entirely push it out. You have to, while you're decolonizing education, you're talking about going back to your roots, going back to your language, community and all. But at the same time, the colonizers' language or English can't be, pushed out of the system entirely, because the whole, the job market is still dependent on it. So yeah, that is one essential consideration, I'd say, when you're decolonizing education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. How about Atilio? What would you consider as one essential consideration when decolonizing education?
Yeah. So I think I would have to say something like consider surprising relationships, and I mean that in terms of, so in terms of like the quipu or even these newer database systems, I think that like there's been like compromises that enable that enable these things to work. So I think, for example, like for a quipu, let's say, having a base 10 system and having, let's say, like 1 or 2 colors to signify categories, kind of perhaps gets rid of the possibility to show things that aren't discrete, and things like that. And for example, some database systems that I've talked about make some compromises about getting, the most recent data or something like that. And so I think that it's important to kind of see the big picture in that sense and see like, well, what do these systems allow versus what they don't allow for, and then kind of be smart about picking and choosing. So kind of like Nabeela said with English, even though the goal is to decolonize, we are in a system in which English provides opportunities. Yeah, and so kind of.
Thank you for that. And Sara, how would you respond to that question?
Yes, adding to what my colleague says regarding this question, I would add that it's important in any educational system, whether formal or non-formal, to consider the background and the culture of individuals. So there was like an assumption from before that it doesn't matter what language you speak from before, what's your culture from before, but now on we're trying to show people that their culture is important. It adds richness to the class, to their writing, to their learning as well. So they can sort of draw connections between their first language, their first culture that they came in from, and the language they're learning, English and so on. So that adds confidence to people when learning, and adds also motivation to show that whatever they learned from before is respected, and it can actually add to the language, to whatever we're learning at the moment. That's from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I've got an additional question that's coming from Margaret. It's for Nabeela, and I think it kind of ties in with one of the previous questions that I've asked already. And she says, are there specific indigenous and traditional ways of learning you believe the global North education could really benefit from?
I'm not exactly sure about that. Like, I think there was a similar question before this, and I told that this is one point I've missed out on my study, and I wish.
I think we are suffering a technical. Yeah, I think we've got a technical fault, but we'll wait for her to reconnect. I will just 2 seconds. There's another question that I had for Sara. Sorry. Yeah. So, what challenges do you face when you are interviewing, when you are having these conversations, in the creative groups with refugees? I don't know if you are also including asylum seekers within your group, or are they only refugees? So the fact that there's this different status, within the people within one group, does that prove to you as a challenge within themselves? Because sometimes even minor groups within their own communities, there is kind of a caste system. There's a better refugee and a less better refugee, and not only that. I also want to take you to the contemporary system, like what's happening at the moment, whereby Ukrainian refugees are now coming and they are kind of being given this red carpet approach. But Syrian refugees, who've been here, they've always been looked down upon. What problems do you face when you are within a group where you've got all these different classes of people who are refugees?
Yes, so at first I just wanted to include refugees in my study, but I thought actually including asylum seekers and refugees would benefit, would enrich my data as well. What I found when I started interviews, that people who have gained their refugee status are more relaxed, I'd say. They're not very concerned about what they say, what questions I ask. But those who are still in the beginning, let's say they have been here in the country for a short time, like a year or two, they wanted to check that every question is appropriate, that they can delete, no one will know their names, and so on. So I had to reassure them that there are no legal consequences on answering my questions. There are only questions about writing and social support and so on. This is one of the like challenges that I faced with interviews. I also realized that some of them, they have met me in the group setting. So I visited the group before doing the interviews. So those who were there, they were like talking to me easily. But those who I met individually, they were very concerned. Who am I? Why am I speaking to them? What do I want? And so on. So for some of the conversation, it took me like 20 minutes icebreakers before starting the conversation. I thought it's also important because I'm speaking to people from different countries, like from Iran, Africa, Middle East, and so on. So it's important for me to understand their background before speaking to each of them. So this is a bit of additional research to do before speaking to individuals, because they vary. They're really different, and different stories, different languages, and so on. So I think it has to do a lot of preparation before starting just approaching people randomly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because it's very similar to the research that I'm conducting as well when I speak to refugees and asylum seekers. The challenge that I face is to do with trust, because essentially I am asking people to share their lives, the most traumatic bits of their lives to me as a narrative, whilst I'm trying to gain this knowledge. And one way that I've kind of tried to get around it is to be able to tell my story to them first. So essentially, they would feel that, okay, he is just like me. And then it's kind of easier then to start developing that conversation, that trust. And even the level of detail that they end up opening up to you, the amount of stories that you want, the amount of stories that they're prepared to give you, it changes altogether when they know that you've been through a particular journey, you've been through a similar journey. So I understand, when you say some of the refugees, so you need 20 minutes to kind of for them to warm up to you. In my case, I've needed days or even weeks. There has to be that constant conversations first, communication, and because essentially you just can't trust anyone with your story.
That's right.
Sorry, go on.
And that adds also an aspect that my supervisor mentioned when I started is the power relationships. Although you don't feel like superior or anything, but they will still see you this way because you're coming as a researcher. You want to ask questions, so you need to be aware of this when starting to introduce yourself. Just similar to them, I also share my story about coming from a refugee background and so on, so that eases them as well. But I like your idea of talking to them a lot before starting the interview. I think that would help as well.
Atilio, do you face any such challenges, or is your research purely based on secondary data? Do you deal with people who are actually practicing people at the moment?
So yeah, I currently do not deal with current people, which I definitely see as definitely interested more in that area, but right now I'm kind of focused on like formal aspects or things that could be called axioms, I guess, in certain terms. I think I feel so certainly very interested in literature about actual practitioners. Something that I've found is that sorry, I just got distracted. Something that I found was that there's very few indigenous scholars involved in this kind of thing, and I think that just also goes that's a huge problem, and it's extremely deep, because as I mentioned, even I'm not indigenous, but I am like an asylee in the U.S. Or was. I'm a citizen now, but so typically, marginalized, communities and people who belong to those are focusing on kind of survival methods, or methods to reach financial security and stability. And so that's honestly half the reason I went to tech. I do love it, but that that helped, and so I think that I think that that shows that not only are people in this situation where these data practices aren't respected as much as they perhaps should be, but there's a whole nother level of stopping people from finding out that this is interesting and worthy of scholarly and professional interest, and so that's just something that I found, and pretty expected, kind of be in the nature, but it's a big issue, that indigenous people are rarely involved in these kind of issues, and so I do acknowledge that, but at the same time I want to do my part to elevate those knowledges.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've just been informed that unfortunately Nabeela won't be able to rejoin, and also the other presenter whom we were expecting to be making a live presentation, you won't be able to turn up. So unless if you've got any other input that you think might be interesting to this discussion, I think it's about time that I say thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us in these discussions. I'm quite grateful, and also the production team from NTU and all the organizers from Building Conference. We thank you so much for your participation in these discussions. The next panel will be at 12:30, and we'll be discussing issues of modernity, higher education, and epistemology. Some of these words I find them difficult to pronounce. So thank you once again for showing up for the discussions, and much appreciated for your presentation. We will be in touch soon just to give you a formal thank you by email. Otherwise, I think it's goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, guys. Take care.